October 24, 1944. The smell of diesel and salt water fills the conning tower of USS Tang as Commander Richard O'Kane watches through the periscope, his hands steady, his breathing controlled. Outside, in the black chop of the Formosa Strait, a Japanese convoy is burning, 3 ships already. His crew has been at battle stations for hours. Tang is the most successful American submarine in the Pacific, 24 ships sunk, more tonnage sent to the bottom than any other boat in the fleet. O'Kane himself is a legend, precise, aggressive, methodical, the kind of commander who wins wars. He orders the 24th torpedo of this patrol fired, the last one in the tubes. What happens in the next few seconds will end Tang's war, end O'Kane's freedom, and kill most of the men he has served with for years. Not because of Japanese depth charges, not because of a destroyer's guns, not because of anything the enemy does, because of that torpedo. It leaves the tube at 46 knots. It should travel a straight line into the burning hull of a Japanese transport 400 yards away. It does not travel a straight line. It begins to curve. Slowly at first, then tighter. The men in the conning tower see it on the surface, phosphorescent wake tracing a wide arc through the darkness, curving back, coming around, pointing now not at the convoy, but at the submarine that fired it. O'Kane orders emergency measures. The engines go full, the rudder goes hard over. Tang, 940 tons of American steel, tries to outrun a weapon it built and carried and launched itself. It cannot. The torpedo strikes Tang in the stern at 46 knots. 49 of her crew of 87 die in the explosion and the flooding that follows. The survivors, including O'Kane, are captured by the Japanese. The deadliest American submarine of the entire Pacific War is sitting on the bottom of the Formosa Strait, 180 feet down, sunk by the last torpedo it ever fired. How does something like that happen? Part 1. The weapon that didn't work. The Mark 14 torpedo. That is where this investigation has to start, because without understanding the Mark 14, nothing that follows makes sense. The Mark 14 was the standard torpedo carried by American submarines throughout the Pacific War. It weighed 2,215 pounds. It carried a warhead packed with 668 pounds of Torpex explosive. It ran at 46 knots on high speed, or 31.5 knots on low. On paper, it was a sophisticated weapon, a product of years of development by the Naval Torpedo Station at Newport, Rhode Island, the same institution that had been developing American torpedoes since 1869. On paper. In practice, the Mark 14 was a disaster of almost incomprehensible proportions. The problems were not discovered in peacetime, because the Naval Torpedo Station had never actually tested the Mark 14 under combat conditions. Live warhead tests were considered too expensive. Depth-keeping tests were conducted with dummy warheads that were lighter than the real thing. The result was a weapon that, when fired in combat with a real warhead, ran an average of 11 feet deeper than set. If a submarine commander set his torpedo to run at 10 feet, the standard depth for hitting a surface ship, the Mark 14 would run at 21 feet, passing harmlessly under the target's keel. This was not a minor calibration error. This was a systematic, structural flaw in the most important weapon in the American submarine fleet, and the Naval Torpedo Station spent the first 18 months of the war insisting it wasn't their problem. Submarine commanders knew something was wrong immediately. Within weeks of the war's start, commanders were filing reports. Torpedoes were running under targets. Torpedoes were hitting targets and not exploding. Torpedoes were hitting targets, exploding, and still not sinking them. Commander Tyrrell Jacobs of USS Sargo fired 13 torpedoes at Japanese targets in January 1942. 0 hits. He filed a report. The torpedo station said it was operator error. Here is the thing that should make you furious. The Mark 14's depth problem was not confirmed by official testing until June 1942, 6 months into the war. The fix was not implemented across the fleet until the fall of that year. Submarine commanders had been losing kills, and in some cases losing their lives, for a year, while bureaucrats in Newport argued about whose fault it was. But the depth problem was only the first of 3 separate compounding failures in the Mark 14 system. The second failure was the Mark 6 exploder. The Mark 6 was a magnetic exploder, a device designed to detonate the torpedo when it passed under a ship's magnetic field, rather than requiring a direct contact hit. The concept was elegant. Instead of hitting the hull, the torpedo would pass beneath the ship and detonate directly under the keel, where the explosion would be maximally destructive. One torpedo, properly placed, could break a ship's back. The problem was that the Mark 6's magnetic influence mechanism was exquisitely sensitive to variations in the Earth's magnetic field. In the Pacific, particularly in equatorial regions, those variations were significant enough to trigger premature detonations, torpedoes exploding before they reached the target or not exploding at all. Commanders were ordered to deactivate the magnetic feature and rely on contact detonation. Many did so without official authorization, because the alternative was firing expensive, complicated, dangerous weapons that simply didn't work. When they switched to contact detonation, they discovered the third failure. The Mark 6 contact exploder had a firing pin mechanism that was too fragile for direct hits. When a torpedo struck a target at a 90-degree angle, a perfect textbook hit, the impact was so sudden and so forceful that the firing pin crushed before it could travel far enough to detonate the warhead. The torpedo hit. The torpedo did not explode. The crew of the target ship felt a clunk and looked at each other. Think about what this meant for the men inside those submarines. They had stalked a target for hours, sometimes days. They had maneuvered through convoy escorts, past destroyers, past anti-submarine patrols. They had lined up their shot with precision. They had fired. They had heard the torpedo run. They had heard it hit. And nothing happened. Commander Slade Cutter of USS Seahorse, 28 years old. A former All-American football player from the United States Naval Academy class of 1935 from Oswego, Illinois, fired a torpedo at a Japanese freighter in 1943 that struck the target squarely amidships. The torpedo made a sound described in his patrol report as a thud. The freighter sailed on. Cutter was not an unusual case. He was typical. The contact exploder problem was not confirmed until September 1943, nearly 2 full years into the war. The fix, when it finally came, was embarrassingly simple. The firing pins needed to be made stronger. The solution had been available the entire time. 3 separate failures. Running too deep, premature magnetic detonation, fragile contact exploder. Any one of them would have been a serious problem. All 3 together, compounding and interacting, turned the Mark 14 into a weapon that American submariners could not trust. And there was a 4th failure, the one that killed Tang. The Mark 18 electric torpedo. The Navy introduced the Mark 18 in 1943 as a solution to one of the Mark 14's most visible problems, its visible wake. The Mark 14 ran on steam, which left a trail of bubbles on the surface that Japanese lookouts could follow back to the submarine. The Mark 18 ran on electric motors and left no wake. It was slower, 28 knots versus 46, but it was invisible. What the Mark 18 was also capable of, under specific conditions of mechanical failure, was running in a circle. The gyroscope that maintained the torpedo's directional stability could malfunction. If it did, the torpedo's rudder would deflect and the weapon would begin to curve. At 28 knots, a circular run brought the torpedo back to the vicinity of the firing submarine in approximately 15 to 30 seconds, depending on the exact nature of the malfunction. The submarine, which had just fired and was still maneuvering, might not have time to dive deep enough to avoid it. This was a known failure mode. It had been documented. It had killed USS Tullabee in March 1944, a circular run from one of her own Mark 18 torpedoes, with only 1 survivor. It had killed USS Wahoo in October 1943, though in that case the evidence was never conclusive. The circular run problem was in the technical literature, it was in the patrol reports, it was waiting for Tang. Part 2. The man who made Tang deadly. Richard Hetherington O'Kane did not come to Submarine Command the way most officers did. He came through Dudley Morton. Morton was a force of nature, 6 feet tall, 200 pounds, a man who ran a submarine the way a football coach ran a team, with noise and intensity and absolute conviction in his own judgment. When Morton took command of Wahoo in December 1942, he brought O'Kane with him as his executive officer, and together they invented something that had not existed in American submarine doctrine before: the aggressive, surface-running, daylight torpedo attack. Pre-war submarine doctrine was cautious. Submarines were supposed to approach submerged, fire from long range, and dive immediately after. Morton thought this was cowardice, dressed up as procedure. He wanted to close to short range, fire multiple torpedoes in rapid succession, and stay on the surface long enough to confirm the kill. He wanted to see what he was shooting at. O'Kane was his eyes. On Wahoo's patrols in early 1943, O'Kane stood on the bridge and directed the attacks personally, calling out bearing corrections while Morton maneuvered the boat below him. It was an extraordinary partnership. Morton's aggression combined with O'Kane's precision, and between them they turned Wahoo into the most feared submarine in the Pacific in the first half of 1943. In one patrol in January 1943, Wahoo sank 9 ships in 7 days in the Yellow Sea. 9 ships, 7 days. Then Morton was killed. Wahoo was lost with all hands in October 1943, almost certainly sunk by Japanese aircraft in La Perouse Strait. O'Kane was not on board. He had been detached to take his own command. His command was USS Tang. Tang was a Balao-class submarine, commissioned on October 15, 1943. She was 311 feet long, displaced 2,415 tons submerged, and could make 20¼ knots on the surface. She carried 24 torpedoes and a crew of 87 men. O'Kane was 31 years old when he took command, and he had learned everything he knew about aggressive submarine warfare from a man who was already dead. He applied those lessons immediately. Tang's first patrol in January and February of 1944 sent 5 ships to the bottom. Her second patrol in February and March added 6 more. Her third patrol in June and July added 10. Her fourth patrol in September and October added 13. By the time Tang departed Pearl Harbor for her 5th patrol in September of 1944, she had sent 24 ships to the bottom, for a total of 93,824 tons of Japanese shipping. No American submarine had ever done that in 4 patrols. The crew knew what they had. They were not a collection of strangers thrown together by the Navy's assignment system. They were a team, many of them veterans of Tang's earlier patrols, men who had learned O'Kane's methods and trusted them. Motor machinist's mate First Class Clay Decker, 23 years old, from Colville, Utah, a former coal miner who had enlisted in 1941, had been on Tang since commissioning. He knew every valve, every pipe, every mechanical idiosyncrasy of the boat. Chief Torpedoman's mate William Leibold, 24 years old, from Chicago, Illinois, who had worked in a machine shop before the war, was one of the best torpedo men in the Pacific Fleet. These were the men who loaded the Mark 18s, who maintained them, who fired them on O'Kane's command. They were also the men who would be inside Tang when the last one came back. The 5th patrol began in September 1944. Tang's operating area was the Taiwan Strait, the narrow body of water between mainland China and the island of Taiwan, one of the most heavily trafficked shipping lanes in the Japanese Empire. Everything going to and from Japan's conquests in Southeast Asia passed through or near the Taiwan Strait. Oil from the Dutch East Indies, rubber from Malaya, rice from French Indochina, troops going south, wounded going north, supplies going everywhere. It was, in other words, exactly the kind of hunting ground that O'Kane had been trained to exploit. Tang arrived in the Taiwan Strait in late September and began hunting immediately. She found convoys, she attacked them, she sank them. By the night of October 24, 1944, Tang had been on patrol for 29 days. She had fired 23 torpedoes. She had sunk 12 ships. The 12th ship, a transport, had gone down that same evening. Tang had 1 torpedo left. 1. O'Kane's standing doctrine was to expend all torpedoes before returning to base. The philosophy was simple. A submarine at sea with torpedoes is doing its job. A submarine at sea without torpedoes is a steel tube waiting for something to kill it. Fire everything, then go home. There was a convoy in the Taiwan Strait that night. There were ships worth killing. There was 1 torpedo. O'Kane ordered it loaded. And here is where this investigation has to slow down, because what happened next unfolded in seconds, and understanding it requires understanding the exact sequence of events. Part 3. 23 knots. 180 degrees. The time was approximately 2:30 in the morning on October 25, 1944. Tang was on the surface in the Taiwan Strait. The night was dark. The convoy was ahead of them. O'Kane had the con. The torpedo was a Mark 18, electric, no wake, number 24. O'Kane gave the order. The torpedo was fired from the forward tubes. For approximately 15 seconds, everything was normal. Then, the torpedo turned. Not a gentle curve, not a slow drift off course. A hard turn. The gyroscope had failed catastrophically, the rudder had gone hard over, and the torpedo was executing what the technical manuals called a circular run. At 28 knots, in a tight circle, it was coming back. O'Kane saw it. Or rather, he saw the phosphorescent wake it left in the dark water, the one thing the Mark 18 was supposed to eliminate, now betraying the torpedo's trajectory in the darkness. He gave the order to turn. Tang began to swing. She was not fast enough. The torpedo struck Tang in the stern at approximately 2:30 in the morning. The explosion was catastrophic. The after section of the submarine was destroyed. The men in the aft torpedo room and the maneuvering room died instantly. Tang began to sink. Hold that. The deadliest submarine in the Pacific War. 31 ships, 116,000 tons, the boat that Dudley Morton's doctrine had built, that Richard O'Kane had turned into a precision instrument of destruction, sunk by torpedo number 24. O'Kane was on the bridge when the explosion hit. He was thrown into the water. Others on the bridge were also thrown clear. Below decks, the men who survived the initial explosion were now trapped in a sinking submarine. What happened next is one of the most documented and most extraordinary survival stories in American naval history, and it rests on the testimony of the men who lived it, because most of them did not. Tang sank to approximately 180 feet. She settled on the bottom of the Taiwan Strait. Of the 87 men aboard, most were already dead, killed in the explosion, drowned as the boat flooded, overcome by chlorine gas from the batteries as seawater contacted them. But there were survivors in the forward torpedo room, 9 men sealed in the compartment that was still holding air. Pharmacist's mate First Class Paul Larson, 26 years old from Minneapolis, Minnesota, who had been a hospital orderly before the war, was among them. He had been thrown against a bulkhead by the explosion and had a gashed forehead and a probable concussion. He helped organize the survivors. He helped prepare the Momsen lungs, emergency escape devices, essentially primitive rebreathers that gave the men their only chance of reaching the surface from 180 feet. The Momsen lung had never been used in a successful combat escape from that depth. The recommended maximum depth for its use was considered to be around 100 feet. They were at 180. 9 men went into the escape trunk. 13 men made it out of the submarine. Some had escaped directly from the torpedo room hatch. Of those who made it to the surface, some were picked up by Japanese destroyers that were already in the area, hunting Tang after her attacks on the convoy. Richard O'Kane was one of the survivors. He had been in the water since the explosion, treading water in the Taiwan Strait while Japanese ships circled above the wreck of his submarine. He was picked up by a Japanese destroyer. He was taken prisoner. He would spend the rest of the war in a prisoner of war camp in Japan. When O'Kane was liberated in August 1945, he was asked about Tang's final patrol. His response, recorded in subsequent interviews and his own memoir, was precise and analytical. The response of a man who had spent months in a prison camp thinking through exactly what had happened and why. "We had fired 23 torpedoes," he said, "and they had all performed as required. The 24th had not. He did not blame the crew. He did not blame the weapon system in the abstract. He stated, flatly, that a mechanical failure in a known failure mode had destroyed his boat. The circular run problem was not a mystery. It was a documented failure. It had happened before. "A fine ship," O'Kane wrote later of Tang, "lost to a circular run." Hold those words. We will come back to them. People who go down to the sea in submarines face the ocean on terms the ocean sets. And if this investigation is giving you a clearer picture of what that looked like, not the version that survived in the press releases, but the version that men wrote down when they were trying to understand how they had survived when their shipmates had not, press the like button. It keeps this history visible a little longer. It matters. Part 4. The Forensic Verdict. Here is the forensic verdict of this investigation. Tang's destruction was not a freak accident. It was the convergence of 3 separate systemic failures, each of which had been identified, documented, and inadequately addressed before October 24, 1944. The first failure was the Mark 18's circular run problem. This was not unknown. USS Tullaby had been destroyed by a circular run from her own Mark 18 in March 1944, 7 months before Tang. The Navy's Bureau of Ordnance had been notified. The technical cause, gyroscope instability under specific failure conditions, was understood. The solution that was eventually implemented involved a modified gyroscope mechanism. That modification was not yet universal across the fleet by October 1944. The second failure was doctrinal. O'Kane's aggressive tactics, fire everything, confirm kills, fire until the last torpedo is gone, were the tactics that had made Tang the most lethal submarine in the Pacific. They were also the tactics that left Tang on the surface at 2:30 in the morning with 1 torpedo remaining, in the middle of a convoy in the Taiwan Strait with no margin for error. A more conservative commander would have broken off the attack with 1 torpedo remaining and returned to base. O'Kane was not a conservative commander. He had been trained by Morton not to be. The third failure was the compounded legacy of the first 3 years of American torpedo problems. By October 1944, American submarine commanders had spent nearly 3 years operating with weapons they could not fully trust. The culture that had developed in response, aggressive, improvisational, willing to accept calculated risks with the weapons themselves, was a rational adaptation to irrational circumstances. But it meant that the known risks of the Mark 18, including the circular run, were accepted as part of doing business. The men who built that culture did not choose it carelessly. They chose it because the alternative, cautious, conservative, by the book, had proven ineffective against Japanese shipping when the torpedoes didn't work. Morton's doctrine, O'Kane's refinement of it, Tang's 5 patrols, these were not recklessness. They were adaptation. They were what happened when professional men were given broken tools and told to win a war. And they did win the war, or at least their part of it. American submarines sank 5.3 million tons of Japanese shipping during the Pacific War, 54.6% of all Japanese merchant shipping lost. They sank 176 Japanese warships. They did this with a force that never exceeded 50,000 men, in boats that were underwater when they were most at risk, with weapons that spent the first 2 years of the war failing in 3 different ways simultaneously. Tang's contribution to that total, 116,000 tons, 31 ships, was the highest of any American submarine. achieved in 5 patrols, achieved in under a year of active combat operations. Let's account for the men. Of Tang's 87 crew on the 5th patrol, 78 were killed, either in the explosion, during the sinking, or during the escape attempt. 9 survived to be rescued from the water. Of those 9, all were taken prisoner by the Japanese. All 9 survived captivity and were liberated in August 1945. Richard Hetherington O'Kane survived. He was awarded the Medal of Honor for his actions on Tang's 5th patrol, the citation covering the attacks of October 23rd and 24th, 1944, the same night the boat was lost. He was 32 years old when he was liberated. He continued his naval career, eventually retiring as a rear admiral in 1957. He wrote his memoir, Wahoo, The Patrols of America's Most Famous World War II Submarine, and later, Clear the Bridge, The War Patrols of the USS Tang. He died on February 16, 1994, in Bremerton, Washington, at the age of 81. He had spent 50 years knowing exactly what had happened to his boat. William Leibold, the chief torpedo man who had loaded and maintained the Mark 18, survived captivity and was liberated in 1945. He lived to be 91 years old, dying in 2008. In interviews conducted decades after the war, he described the night of October 24th with the same precision that characterized O'Kane's own accounts: the mechanics of the torpedo loading, the attack run, the explosion, the chaos of the sinking, the escape. He never expressed bitterness. He expressed something closer to the professional's understanding that systems fail, that machinery fails, and that the men inside the machinery do what they can. Clay Decker, the motor machinist from Colville, Utah, did not survive. He was among the 78 dead. Paul Larson, the pharmacist's mate who helped organize the escape from the torpedo room, did survive. He was liberated in 1945 and returned to Minnesota. Dudley Morton, whose doctrine Tang had carried to 31 kills, was never recovered. Wahoo went down in La Perouse Strait in October 1943 with all hands. Morton was 35 years old. He was awarded the Medal of Honor posthumously. His body was not found. The circular run problem that killed Tang was addressed after the war. The Mark 18's gyroscope mechanism was analyzed, the failure mode was documented in detail, and subsequent torpedo designs incorporated more robust stabilization systems. The specific flaw that sent torpedo number 24 back into Tang's stern was, in retrospect, fixable. The technical knowledge to fix it existed. The urgency to fix it, before October 1944, before Tang's 5th patrol, did not. That is the hardest part of this verdict to sit with. Not that Tang was destroyed. Submarines are destroyed in wars. Not that men died inside her. Men die in submarines. The hardest part is the 7 months between USS Tullabee and USS Tang. 7 months between the first documented American submarine lost to its own circular running torpedo and the second. 7 months in which the fix was known, the failure mode was understood, and the modification was not yet complete across the fleet. 7 months. Tang sailed on her 5th patrol inside that 7-month window. Now, back to the beginning. January 24, 1945. 3 months after Tang was lost, American submarines were still hunting in the same waters: the Taiwan Strait, the South China Sea, the approaches to Japan. They were still firing Mark 18s. The circular run problem was still not fully resolved across every boat in the fleet. The war would not end for another 7 months. O'Kane was in a prison camp in Japan, writing nothing, saying nothing, keeping what he knew inside until liberation came. He had commanded the most effective submarine in the history of American naval warfare. He had watched it die from inside the water, treading in the Taiwan Strait, while the wreck of Tang settled onto the bottom below him. When he was finally asked, after liberation, after the debrief, after the medal and the citations and the official recognition, what he thought of Tang, what he wanted people to understand about what had happened, he said what he had already written. "A fine ship," he said. Lost to a circular run. Not a lament, not an accusation, a statement of fact from a man who had spent his professional life understanding that the difference between a successful attack and a catastrophic one was sometimes measured in the mechanical tolerances of a gyroscope. The 46 men who went down with Tang on the night of October 24, 1944, the men who died in the explosion, the men who drowned in the flooding compartments, the men who made it out of the escape trunk and did not survive the surface, they died because of a gyroscope, a component, a part, a failure mode that had been documented 7 months earlier and not yet fixed. They were professionals. They were the best submarine crew in the Pacific. They were operating the most lethal boat in the American fleet, and the weapon they had spent 5 patrols trusting came back for them. That is not a lesson about carelessness. It is not a lesson about recklessness. It is a lesson about the gap between what institutions know and what institutions fix, and about the men who live and die inside that gap. Quite a vessel. Lost to a circular run. If this investigation gave you something, not the version of Tang that survived in the commendation letters, but the version that O'Kane carried for 50 years, press the like button. Subscribe if you want the next chapter, and remember, the most dangerous weapon in any war is not always the one pointed at the enemy.